The snow-laden wind howled through the broken window panes of Bethany Keller's small cabin as she emptied the last jar of beans into a pot that looked almost as hollow as her heart. Outside, Panamint Valley, California stretched barren and unforgiving under the winter of 1878, a year that had already taken too much from her. The last 3 copper pennies sat heavy in her apron pocket, the final reminder of her late husband's wages from the silver mine before the collapse that had claimed him 5 months ago. "Mama, is there going to be more food tomorrow?" 6-year-old Sarah's voice trembled with a forced bravery that no child should need to summon. Bethany forced a smile, tucking a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear as she stirred the meager meal. "The good Lord provides, sweet girl. Now, go tell your brother's supper's almost ready." The 2 boys, Daniel, almost 9, and Henry, barely 4, sat huddled by the crumbling fireplace where the last of their firewood burned weakly. Bethany divided the beans into 4 portions, making hers the smallest. As they ate in silence, she watched her children's hollow cheeks and wondered how many more days they could survive like this. The mine owner had given her a widow's stipend for 3 months, then nothing. The townspeople of Panamint had been kind at first, bringing food and offering condolences, but winter had been harsh on everyone. Her sewing skills weren't enough to keep her family fed, not in a town where most folks were struggling themselves. After the children fell asleep that night, all 3 curled together in the cabin's single bed, Bethany knelt on the cold floor, clasped her hands, and prayed through her tears. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "I don't ask for myself but my children. They're hungry, and I have nothing left to give them." As if in answer, the wind howled harder, and something on the cabin's roof came loose with a crack. Dawn broke with a gray reluctance across Panamint Valley. Bethany woke early, her breath fogging in the frigid air of the cabin. The fire had died overnight, and there wasn't a single piece of wood left to rekindle it. She wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped outside, hoping to gather scraps from the woodpile that might have been overlooked. The landscape was bleak, dusted with a light coating of snow unusual for this part of California. Her gaze traveled to the distant mountains, then to the trail leading into town. That's when she saw him. A lone rider approached, his horse moving at a steady pace despite the cold. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. As he drew nearer, she could make out a pack horse trailing behind, loaded with supplies. Bethany's heart quickened, though whether from hope or fear she couldn't say. Strangers in these parts could mean trouble, especially for a woman alone with children. The rider spotted her and adjusted his course toward the cabin. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. A neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw, and when he removed his hat, she noticed his eyes were a startling blue against his tanned skin. "Madam," he called out, his voice deep and clear. "Name's Bryce Xavier. I'm looking for the Keller place." Bethany's hand went to her throat. "This is it," she said cautiously. "I'm Bethany Keller," he nodded, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his size. "Mrs. Keller, I worked with your husband at the Panamint silver mine before moving on to the new diggings near Darwin. I've only just heard about Thomas." His expression softened. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," she replied, her guard still up. "What brings you to our door?" "Thomas saved my life when a shaft started to collapse last year." He ran a hand through his dark hair, dislodging a dusting of snow. "He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd check on his family." His gaze moved to the cabin, taking in the broken window, the sagging porch. Looks like I'm a bit late in keeping that promise." Before Bethany could respond, the cabin door creaked open and Daniel stepped out, his thin frame swimming in a coat that had once fit him properly. "Mama," he called, eyeing the stranger warily. "It's all right, Daniel," she assured him. "This is Mr. Xavier. He was a friend of your father's." Bryce knelt to the boy's level, extending a hand. "Your pa talked about you all the time. Said you were the spitting image of him, and I can see he wasn't exaggerating." Daniel hesitantly shook the man's hand, his face solemn. "I've brought some supplies," Bryce continued, turning back to Bethany. "Would it be all right if I unloaded them for you?" Bethany felt a rush of emotions: pride, gratitude, embarrassment. "We don't need charity, Mr. Xavier." His expression remained steady. "It's not charity, Mrs. Keller. It's a debt repaid. Your husband would have done the same for me." The sincerity in his eyes broke through her resolve. With a small nod, she stepped aside. From the pack horse, Bryce unloaded sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and sugar. There were potatoes, salt pork, dried apples, and even a small bag of hard candies that made Sarah's and Henry's eyes widen when they emerged from the cabin. He'd brought blankets, too, and a stack of split firewood that he immediately began arranging in the woodbox by the hearth. By midday, a fire roared in the fireplace, and the smell of real stew with meat and vegetables filled the cabin. The children sat at the table, watching in wonder as Bethany stirred the pot, adding pinches of salt and dried herbs that Bryce had provided. "How long will you be in Panamint, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. He paused from repairing the broken window, having produced nails and a small sheet of glass from his seemingly endless supplies. "I hadn't given it much thought, to be honest. The Darwin mines are shut down for the season due to the weather. I was planning to head south to Arizona, but—" He glanced around at the cabin, his eyes lingering on the areas that needed repair. "I reckon I could stay a spell if there's work to be had." "There's not much work in town this time of year," Bethany admitted. "Everyone's just trying to get through till spring." "Well, there seems to be plenty of work right here," he observed, nodding toward the leaking roof. "If you'd allow me to help, Mrs. Keller." She should refuse. A single woman with children couldn't have a man staying on her property without inviting scandal. But the roof needed fixing, the woodpile needed replenishing, and her children needed food. "There's an old lean-to out back," she said finally. "It's not much, but you're welcome to it if you're determined to stay." His smile revealed a dimple in his right cheek. "I've slept in worse places, Mrs. Keller. Much worse." That evening they ate around the table, a real family meal for the first time in months. The children peppered Bryce with questions about his travels, and he answered each one with patience and good humor, spinning tales of cattle drives in Texas and gold mining in Colorado. After the children were tucked into bed with full bellies and the promise of more food tomorrow, Bethany found Bryce on the porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and gazing at the stars. "Thank you," she said simply, drawing her shawl tightly around her against the cold night air. He extinguished the cigarette, respectfully turning to face her. "No need for thanks. Thomas was a good man." "Yes, he was." She swallowed past the lump in her throat. "He spoke of you too, you know. Said you were the best shot in the territory and could track a mountain lion across bare rock." Bryce chuckled softly. He was prone to exaggeration. "Perhaps." She smiled faintly, then grew serious. "Mr. Xavier, I can't pay you for the supplies or your help. I'm not looking to be paid, Mrs. Keller. Nevertheless, I don't accept handouts. I'll find a way to repay your kindness." He studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Fair enough. How about this? I need a place to winter and you need repairs done. I'll fix what needs fixing, cut enough firewood to last till spring, and help with hunting to put meat on your table. In exchange, I get use of your lean-to and maybe a meal when you're cooking anyway." It was a generous offer, framed to protect her pride. Bethany knew it for what it was, this man giving far more than he would receive, but she also recognized the lifeline it represented for her family. "We have a deal, Mr. Xavier," she agreed, extending her hand formally. His large hand enveloped hers, warm despite the cold night. "Bryce, please. If I'm to be your tenant, we might as well use Christian names." "Bryce," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "I'm Bethany." His smile in the moonlight caused something to flutter in her chest, something she immediately tried to suppress. She was a widow with 3 children to raise. There was no room in her life for such feelings, no matter how kind or handsome the man before her might be. As she bid him good night and returned to the cabin, Bethany didn't notice how Bryce's gaze followed her, or how his expression softened with something more than mere kindness. The first week of Bryce's stay brought more changes than Bethany had thought possible. By day, he worked tirelessly patching the roof, mending fences, chopping enough firewood to fill the woodshed to bursting. In the evenings, he'd return from hunting with rabbits or a wild turkey, teaching Daniel how to clean and prepare the game. The children took to him immediately. Daniel shadowed his every move, soaking up knowledge about tracking and tools and the ways of the wild. Sarah, usually shy around strangers, had blossomed under his attention, especially when he sat patiently teaching her to whittle small animal figures from soft pine. Even little Henry, who barely remembered his father, would climb fearlessly into Bryce's lap with a book, demanding stories. It was after one such evening, with the children finally asleep and a comfortable silence settling between them, that Bethany found the courage to ask what had been on her mind. "You never married?" she inquired, her hands busy with mending. Bryce looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, or maybe I was too busy chasing the next big strike." He hesitated, then added, "My parents had an unhappy marriage, made me cautious about taking that step without being certain." "That's wise," Bethany nodded. "Thomas and I were young when we wed, barely 18, both of us. We grew up together here in Panamint. You loved him very much." "It wasn't a question." "I did." She set down her sewing, looking into the fire. "He was a good man, a good father. Not perfect, he had big dreams, always chasing that fortune just around the corner. That's what took him to the mines instead of farming like his father." She smiled sadly. "But his heart was true." "He spoke of you often," Bryce said gently, "his beautiful Bethany and his 3 little ones." He was working that extra shift the day of the collapse to buy Sarah a proper dress for Christmas. Tears welled in Bethany's eyes. "That sounds like Thomas." Without thinking, Bryce moved to sit beside her, his large hand covering hers. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause you pain." "No," she whispered, not pulling her hand away. "It's good to hear these things, to know he was thinking of us even then." They sat in silence, the firelight painting gold across their faces, their hands still connected in that small, significant point of contact. When Bethany finally withdrew her hand, it was with reluctance that surprised her. "I should turn in," she said, rising. "Dawn comes early, that it does." Bryce stood as well, towering over her in the small cabin. "Sleep well, Bethany." As she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of her children, Bethany tried to untangle the emotions stirring within her. Guilt, for the way her heart had quickened at Bryce's touch. Confusion at how quickly he had become essential to their survival. And beneath it all, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps the worst was behind them. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Bethany was hanging laundry on the line, taking advantage of a rare sunny day, when she spotted two riders approaching from town. She recognized Mayor Howard Peterson, and beside him, Jeremiah Wilkins, the owner of the Panamint silver mine where Thomas had died. Bryce emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harnesses, instantly alert. He moved to stand near Bethany, not hovering but clearly positioning himself protectively. "Mrs. Keller," the mayor called, tipping his hat as they drew near. "Fine day, isn't it, Mayor Peterson, Mr. Wilkins," she acknowledged, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you gentlemen out this way?" The men dismounted, and Wilkins' eyes narrowed as he took in Bryce's presence. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Bryce Xavier," he replied evenly, extending his hand. "I worked your mine for a spell last year alongside Thomas Keller." Recognition flickered across Wilkins' face. "Ah, yes, the tracker from Montana. What can we do for you gentlemen?" Bethany prompted, uneasy about their unexpected visit. Mayor Peterson cleared his throat. "Well, Mrs. Keller, it's come to our attention that you've been experiencing some difficulties since your husband's passing." "We've managed," she replied stiffly. "Nevertheless," Wilkins interjected, "the town council has been discussing your situation. We feel it might be best if you considered relocating to town. The mercantile needs a seamstress, and there's a room above the shop that would accommodate you and the children." "And what of this property?" Bryce asked before Bethany could respond. The mayor glanced at Wilkins, then back to Bethany. "Well, as you know, the cabin and land were part of the company housing arrangement. With Thomas gone, the property technically reverts to the mine." Bethany felt the blood drain from her face. "This was my husband's homestead. His father built this cabin, which he sold to the mine 15 years ago when he needed capital," Wilkins reminded her, not unkindly. "Thomas knew the terms of his employment. So you're evicting a widow and 3 children in the dead of winter." Bryce's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. The mayor raised his hands placatingly. "Not at all. We're offering Mrs. Keller employment and housing in town. It's for her own good, really." "A woman alone out here." "I'm not alone," Bethany interrupted, "and I'm not leaving my home." "Mrs. Keller," Wilkins sighed, "I understand your attachment to this place, but the decision isn't really yours to make. The property will be needed come spring when the new foreman arrives." 3 months, Bryce said suddenly. "I beg your pardon." The mayor blinked. "Give Mrs. Keller 3 months, until the end of April. That gives her time to make proper arrangements, and you don't look like heartless men turning out a family during the worst of winter." The 2 town leaders exchanged glances. "I suppose that would be reasonable," the mayor conceded reluctantly. "Though I'm not sure what authority you have to negotiate, Mr. Xavier." "I'm a friend of the family," Bryce replied simply, "and I aim to make sure they're treated fairly." After the men departed, promising to return in April to finalize arrangements, Bethany sank onto the porch steps, her face in her hands. "They can't just take our home," she whispered. Bryce sat beside her, close but not touching. "Is what Wilkins said true, about Thomas selling the homestead?" She nodded miserably. "His father needed money for medical treatment in San Francisco. Thomas always said we'd buy it back someday when he struck it rich." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Another dream that died with him." 3 months is time," Bryce offered. "Time to figure something out." "Like what? I can barely feed my children, let alone buy back this land." He was silent for a moment, then said carefully, "I have some savings from my time in Darwin." Bethany's head snapped up. "No, absolutely not. You've done too much already." "It's just an offer, Bethany. Something to consider." "Why would you do that?" she demanded. "Why would you give everything you've worked for to people you barely know?" His blue eyes met hers, unwavering. "Because sometimes a man finds something worth more than gold or silver." He stood abruptly. I should finish those harnesses before dark." As he walked away, Bethany stared after him, her thoughts in turmoil. What had he meant by that? And why did his words make her heart race in a way it hadn't since she was a young girl falling in love for the first time? That night, long after the children were asleep, Bethany knelt by her bedside, praying for guidance. The problem of the homestead weighed heavily on her mind, but so did the growing feelings she harbored for Bryce Xavier, feelings that brought both joy and guilt in equal measure. "Is it wrong, Lord?" she whispered. "To feel this way so soon after Thomas, to lean so heavily on a man who owes us nothing." No divine answer came, only the quiet creaking of the cabin as the wind brushed against its walls. January gave way to February, and life settled into a rhythm. Bryce continued his improvements to the property, venturing into town occasionally for supplies. Bethany took in what sewing work she could, determined to contribute to their survival. The children thrived under the combined attention, their cheeks filling out as regular meals became the norm rather than the exception. It was during one of Bryce's trips to town that everything changed. He returned earlier than expected, his expression grim as he dismounted. "What is it?" Bethany asked, setting aside the quilt she was piecing together. "There's talk in town," he said, following her into the cabin. "About us." Her stomach clenched. "What kind of talk?" "The kind you'd expect. A widow living with a single man, no matter the separate quarters." He ran a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Flannery at the general store made some pointed comments about propriety, and Reverend Collins asked if we'd be attending services to formalize our arrangement." "Oh," Bethany said softly, her cheeks burning. "I should have expected this." "I'm sorry, Bethany. The last thing I wanted was to damage your reputation. It's not your fault. People will always talk." She busied herself with the kettle, avoiding his gaze. "Perhaps it would be best if you moved on as you originally planned. Is that what you want?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. She turned to face him, finding him much closer than she'd realized. "It doesn't matter what I want. My children's welfare comes first. And would my leaving be in their welfare? Or yours?" His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "Bryce," she began, uncertain how to continue. He took a step closer, near enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Because I don't want to leave, Bethany. Not unless you tell me right now that you feel nothing for me." Her breath caught. "I can't say that." "Then let me stay. Let me court you properly with the Reverend's blessing and the town's knowledge." "Court me," she repeated, stunned by the turn of conversation. "Bryce, I'm a widow with 3 children and no prospects. You could have any woman." "I don't want any woman," he said simply. "I want you. You with your strength and your kindness and the way you sing to Henry when you think no one's listening. I want Daniel and Sarah and this life we've been building. I know it's fast, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. I'm not asking for marriage, not yet. Just the chance to show you and everyone else that my intentions are honorable." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes. "What about the homestead? We'll still lose it come spring." "One problem at a time," he smiled, reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek. "Will you let me court you, Bethany Keller?" In that moment, with his blue eyes earnest and his hand gentle against her face, Bethany felt something bloom within her chest, something she'd thought had died with Thomas. It was hope, yes, but also the undeniable stirrings of love. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing the same air, sharing the same moment of perfect understanding. The sound of the door opening broke them apart. Daniel stood there, a bundle of kindling in his arms, his young face solemn as he looked between them. "Daniel," Bethany began, flustered. "Mr. Xavier, are you going to be our pa now?" The boy asked directly. Bryce knelt to Daniel's level. "That's something your ma and I are discussing. Would you have any objections if I were to court her?" Daniel considered this with all the gravity of his 9 years. "Pa's gone to heaven," he said finally. "He told me before he died that I had to take care of Ma and Sarah and Henry, but I'm not big enough yet to do everything." He looked up at Bryce. "If you married Ma, would you help me take care of them until I'm grown?" "I'd be honored to help you," Bryce replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And even when you're grown, we could take care of them together." Daniel nodded decisively. "Then it's all right by me." He glanced at his mother. "Ma's happier when you're here anyway. She smiles more." Bethany felt her cheeks flush. "Daniel Keller, go put that kindling by the stove and wash up for supper." As her son complied, Bethany turned back to Bryce, who was watching her with a mixture of amusement and tenderness. "Well," she said, fighting a smile, "it seems you have Daniel's approval. 1 down, 2 to go," he grinned. "Though I suspect Henry will be easier to convince than Sarah." He was right. That evening, when they gathered the children to explain that Bryce would be courting their mother, Henry clapped his hands in delight, while Sarah regarded them both with cautious eyes. "Does this mean Mr. Xavier will live in the house instead of the lean-to?" she asked. "No, sweetheart," Bethany assured her. "Mr. Xavier will continue to stay in the lean-to until, well, unless things change between us." "If they do change," Bryce added gently, "it would only be with your blessing, Sarah. I'm not trying to replace your pa. No one could do that. But I'd like the chance to be a part of your family, if you'll have me." Sarah studied him solemnly, her small face a mirror of Bethany's when she was deep in thought. "Can I still keep the wooden fox you made me, even if I decide I don't want you to marry Ma?" Bryce's laugh filled the cabin. "Absolutely. That fox is yours no matter what." A small smile finally broke through. "Then I guess it's all right if you court Ma, but you have to make me another animal first." "Deal," he agreed, extending his hand, which she shook with grave formality. That night, after the children were asleep, Bethany and Bryce sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and the newness of their understanding. "We should attend church on Sunday," she said, watching her breath fog in the night air. "Make our intentions known properly." "Yes, madam," he agreed with a smile. "I'll wear my good shirt and everything." She laughed softly, then grew serious. "Bryce, there's something we haven't discussed." "What's that?" "Children, if we," she gestured between them, suddenly shy. "Would you want more children?" "Because I always hoped for a large family, but if you don't, Bethany," he interrupted gently, taking her hand. "I would be blessed to have children with you, as many as the good Lord sees fit to give us." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "Even starting with 3 that aren't your own. They're already mine in my heart," he said simply. "Have been since the first night I sat at your table and watched you stretch that stew to feed all of us." She leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she hadn't been in months. "It still seems too good to be true. Like I'll wake tomorrow and you'll be gone and we'll be hungry again." His arm came around her, strong and secure. "I'm not going anywhere, Bethany, not unless you send me away." "Then you'd better get comfortable," she murmured. "Because I have no intention of doing that." Their first appearance as a courting couple at Panamin's small church caused exactly the stir Bethany had anticipated. Whispers followed them down the aisle, and more than one matron raised an eyebrow at Bryce's protective hand at Bethany's back. But Reverend Collins welcomed them warmly, and by the end of the service, several of the women who had once brought food after Thomas's death came to reintroduce themselves. Mrs. Peterson was particularly friendly, Bethany observed as they drove the wagon home, the children riding ahead on Bryce's horse. Amazing how the mayor's wife suddenly remembers our acquaintance now that there's a man in the picture. Bryce chuckled. People respect a family unit. It's the natural order of things. Is that why you're doing this? To restore the natural order, she teased. He gave her a sidelong glance, his expression softening. I'm doing this because from the moment I saw you standing in the snow, fierce as a mountain lion protecting her cubs, I knew you were the woman I'd been waiting for my whole life. Bethany's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. When you say things like that, it makes it very difficult to maintain a proper courtship. His laugh echoed across the valley. Well, we wouldn't want to give Mrs. Peterson more to gossip about, would we? Over the next weeks, Bryce courted Bethany with a thoroughness that touched her deeply. There were small gifts, a hair ribbon purchased in town, wildflowers gathered from the hillside, a rocking chair he crafted himself during the long evenings. But more meaningful were the gestures that showed his devotion to their family. The hours spent teaching Daniel to track and hunt, the stories read to Henry, the patient lessons as Sarah struggled with her sums. February gave way to March, bringing the first hints of spring to Panamint Valley. The trees budded, and green began to reclaim the brown hillsides. With the changing season came the looming reality of April and the loss of their homestead. It was after a particularly long day of planting a vegetable garden that might never see harvest that Bethany finally broached the subject again. We need to talk about what happens when they come for the land, she said, sitting beside Bryce on the porch steps. He nodded, having clearly been expecting this conversation. I've been thinking about that. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. I rode out to the Butler property last week. Old man Butler died this winter, and his son's selling the place to move to San Francisco. The Butler Ranch, Bethany knew it well, a modest spread about 5 miles from town with good water and grazing land. It's a fine property. 160 acres, a solid house. Barn needs some work, but the foundations are good. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. I put down money to hold it. She stared at him, processing his words. You bought a ranch? Not yet. Just paid to keep other buyers away while I talk to you. He took a deep breath. Bethany, I know it's fast. We've only been courting proper for a month. But I love you and I love those children. I want to give you a home that's yours, ours, that no one can take away. Tears welled in her eyes. Bryce, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not asking you to decide right now. We still have weeks before Wilkins and the mayor come calling. But I want you to know the option is there. A new start, a place where we can build something together. How can you afford this? She asked, overwhelmed by his gesture. I told you I'd been saving. The Darwin mines were good to me, and I've never had a family to spend it on. Now I do if you'll have me. Bethany looked out over the homestead, the land she'd loved, where she'd built a life with Thomas and borne her children. Leaving would be painful, but staying wasn't an option. And the thought of building a new life with Bryce, on land that was truly theirs. I need time, she whispered. You have it, he assured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. All the time you need. That night, as Bethany lay awake listening to her children's steady breathing, she let herself fully imagine a future with Bryce Xavier. Marriage, more children perhaps, a home they built together. The vision brought no guilt, only a deep sense of rightness. Thomas would want this for them: happiness, security, love. By morning, her decision was made. The day Mayor Peterson and Jeremiah Wilkins returned to the homestead dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that promised new beginnings. Bethany had spent the previous week packing their belongings and preparing the children for the move. She hadn't accepted Bryce's proposal, yet that would come in its own time, but she had agreed to the Butler Ranch, much to his visible relief. The two men looked surprised to find Bethany calm and composed as they dismounted in the yard. "Mrs. Keller," the mayor began, hat in hand. "I trust you've made arrangements as we discussed." "I have," she replied evenly. "We'll be vacating the property by the end of the week." Wilkins nodded, clearly relieved to avoid a confrontation. "That's very sensible of you. The town council has confirmed your position at the Mercantile, and the room above the shop is being prepared as we speak." "That's very kind," Bethany smiled, "but we won't be needing it. We've made other arrangements." The men exchanged glances. "Other arrangements," the mayor echoed. Bryce stepped forward from where he'd been standing by the barn. "Mrs. Keller and her children will be moving to the Butler Ranch, which I've recently purchased." "The Butler place?" Wilkins' eyebrows rose. "That's a substantial property, Mr. Xavier." "Yes, it is," Bryce agreed, moving to stand beside Bethany. "Big enough for a growing family." Understanding dawned on the mayor's face. "I see. So the rumors in town were true." "If you mean the rumors that Mr. Xavier has been courting me openly and honorably, then yes, they're quite true," Bethany replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Well," Mayor Peterson cleared his throat, "this is certainly an unexpected development, but a fortunate one for all concerned." "Indeed," Bethany said coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have much to do before our move." After the men departed, Bryce turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" "Perhaps a little," she admitted, a smile tugging at her lips. "Especially the look on Wilkins' face when you mentioned the Butler Ranch," Bryce laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "Have I told you lately that you're remarkable, Bethany Keller?" "Not since yesterday," she teased, relaxing against him. "Well, you are." He kissed the top of her head. "And I'm the luckiest man in the territory. Even with 3 children and a stubborn wife-to-be, especially then." His voice grew serious. "Though I don't recall proposing yet." She pulled back to look at him, suddenly uncertain. "I thought when you bought the ranch, oh, I intend to marry you," he assured her quickly. "But a woman like you deserves a proper proposal, not an assumption." Relief flooded through her. "Well then, Mr. Xavier, I'll try to act surprised when the time comes." The move to the Butler Ranch unfolded over the course of several days. Bryce hired wagons from town to transport their belongings, and neighbors sensing the shifting dynamics came to help. Even Mrs. Peterson appeared one afternoon with a basket of bread and preserves. Her earlier frostiness melted away by the evidence of Bryce's prosperity. The house was larger than the cabin, with 4 proper bedrooms and a spacious kitchen. The children explored every corner with excitement, Sarah claiming the sunniest bedroom for herself, while the boys argued good-naturedly over who would get the room with the view of the creek. On their final night at the homestead, after the children were asleep in bedrolls on the bare floor, most of the furniture having already been moved, Bethany found herself standing in the empty main room, memories washing over her. "I brought Thomas home here as a bride," she said softly when Bryce entered. "Daniel was born in that corner where the bed used to be. Sarah took her first steps by that hearth. He came to stand beside her, respecting her nostalgia. It's hard to leave a place that holds so much of your heart." "Yes," she agreed, "but the memories come with us, don't they?" "They do." He hesitated, then added, "and we'll make new ones." She turned to him, suddenly certain. "Yes, we will." His eyes searched hers. "Bethany." "Ask me," she whispered. "Ask me now, in this place where my first life began, so my second can start here too." Understanding bloomed on his face. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee before her, taking her hands in his. "Bethany Keller, you've shown me what true strength looks like. You've taught me that family isn't just blood, but the people you choose to love and protect. I came here to repay a debt to Thomas, but I found something I never knew I was missing." His voice deepened with emotion. "I love you. I love your children as if they were my own. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she managed through the lump in her throat. "Yes, Bryce Xavier, I will marry you." He rose and gathered her into his arms, his kiss tender yet filled with promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," she replied. "The children need stability and I—" She blushed. "I don't want to wait." 2 weeks, he decided. Time enough for the banns to be read and for us to settle into the ranch. 2 weeks, she agreed, sealing the decision with another kiss. The wedding took place on a Saturday in early April, with the apple trees on the Butler now Xavier Ranch in full bloom. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony on the front porch of their new home, with half the town in attendance. Bethany wore a new dress of pale blue calico, with Sarah as her attendant in a matching ribbon. Daniel stood proudly beside Bryce as his best man, while Henry carried the rings on a small pillow, concentrating fiercely on his important task. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Bryce lifted Bethany's veil with gentle hands, his blue eyes filled with such love it took her breath away. "Hello, Mrs. Xavier," he murmured before claiming her lips in a kiss that caused several of the matrons to fan themselves vigorously. The celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. There was music and dancing, the first real festivities Panamint had seen since before the harsh winter. As twilight fell, Bethany found herself momentarily alone, watching her new husband swing Sarah in a spirited dance while Henry clapped along, and Daniel attempted to teach the mayor's daughter to do see-do. "Mrs. Xavier," a voice said beside her, and she turned to find Jeremiah Wilkins offering a glass of punch. "Mr. Wilkins," she acknowledged, accepting the drink. "I owe you an apology," he said unexpectedly. "The way we handled your first husband's death was less than compassionate." Bethany studied him, surprised by the admission. "Thank you for saying so." "Xavier's a good man," Wilkins continued. "The mine could use someone with his skills should he ever tire of ranching." She smiled politely. "I believe his ranching days are just beginning, Mr. Wilkins." "So they are." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings, then." "To new beginnings," she echoed, watching as Bryce set Sarah down and made his way toward her, his face lighting up as their eyes met. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep in their new rooms, Bethany stood in the bedroom she now shared with Bryce, nervous in a way she hadn't expected. Though she'd been married before, this felt different, a choice made in full maturity rather than youthful passion. Bryce entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He'd removed his jacket and tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin. "The children are sleeping?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, moving closer. "Henry insisted I check under his bed for rattlesnakes before he'd close his eyes." "And did you find any?" She smiled, grateful for the small talk that eased her tension. "Nary a one," he assured her, stopping just short of touching her. "Are you all right, Bethany?" The concern in his voice warmed her. "Yes, it's been a long time since I've been a wife." "We don't have to rush anything," he said gently. "We have the rest of our lives." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't want to wait. I want to be your wife in every way, Bryce." His eyes darkened at her words. Slowly, giving her time to adjust to each new intimacy, he began to unpin her hair, letting the auburn waves cascade over her shoulders. His fingers were deft yet unhurried as he helped her undress, his reverence making her feel beautiful despite the changes 3 children had wrought on her body. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Bethany's eyes. Bryce whispered words of love against her skin, his hands and lips learning every part of her as if committing her to memory. Their passion built gradually, like a sunrise breaking over the mountains, until they crested together in a moment of perfect unity. Afterward, nestled in his arms as the moon cast silver light across their bed, Bethany marveled at how thoroughly her life had transformed in the span of a few short months. "What are you thinking?" Bryce murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she admitted. "That when you rode up to our cabin that day, it wasn't just food you brought us." "Oh." His voice was curious, tinged with sleepy contentment. "You filled our table, yes," she said, raising herself on an elbow to look into his eyes. "But more importantly, you filled our hearts." His smile in the moonlight was everything she needed. "As you filled mine, Bethany Xavier, as you filled mine." Spring blossomed into summer, and the Xavier Ranch thrived under their combined care. Bryce proved as skilled at ranching as he had been at mining, gradually building a respectable herd of cattle and horses. Bethany's vegetable garden flourished, providing abundance that she shared with neighbors and preserved for the winter ahead. The children adapted to their new life with resilience that made Bethany proud. Daniel, now approaching 10, followed Bryce everywhere, soaking up knowledge about ranching and riding. Sarah discovered a talent for working with the chickens and dairy cows, while Henry, still the baby at nearly 5, was content to trail after whoever would let him help. In late June, as they sat on the porch after supper watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass, Bethany took Bryce's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "There's going to be another Xavier come winter," she said softly. His expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby, you're certain?" she nodded, tears of joy sparkling in her eyes. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." Bryce gathered her into his arms, his joy palpable. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." The children reacted to the news with varying degrees of excitement. Daniel, practical as always, wondered where the baby would sleep. Sarah immediately began planning what she would teach her new sibling, assuming it would be a girl. Henry, after some consideration, asked if the baby would be able to play with him right away, and seemed disappointed to learn he'd have to wait quite a while for a playmate. As summer waned into autumn, Bethany's body changed with her growing child. Bryce watched the transformation with undisguised fascination and pride, his protective instincts heightened by her condition. He hired additional help for the ranch to ensure Bethany didn't overexert herself, despite her protests that pregnancy wasn't an illness. "Humor me," he'd say, pulling her onto his lap despite her growing girth. "I missed this with the others. Let me fuss over you and our little one." How could she argue with that? So she allowed his indulgences, the extra pillows, the special teas, the foot rubs that often led to more intimate expressions of their love. By December, Panamint Valley was experiencing an unusually cold winter, much like the one that had brought Bryce into their lives the year before. Snow dusted the mountains and occasionally reached down to blanket the ranch, turning the landscape into a wonderland that delighted the children. On Christmas Eve, with a fire crackling in the hearth and pine boughs decorating the mantelpiece, the Xavier family gathered to exchange small gifts. There were hand-carved toys for the boys, a porcelain doll for Sarah that Bryce had ordered all the way from San Francisco, warm shawls and books and candy sticks. As Bethany watched her family, for that's truly what they had become, she felt the baby shift within her, a strong kick that made her gasp softly. "Active tonight?" Bryce asked, instantly alert to her discomfort. "Very," she smiled, taking his hand and placing it where their child danced beneath her heart. "I think he knows it's Christmas." Sarah perked up from her place by the fire. "You think it's a brother?" Bethany exchanged a glance with Bryce. "Just a feeling." "I hope it's a brother," Daniel declared. "Girls talk too much." Sarah stuck out her tongue at him, clutching her new doll protectively. "Girls," Henry announced with the wisdom of his 5 years, "are good for some things, like cookies and stories." Laughter filled the room, warming Bethany's heart even as another pain, sharper this time, caused her to wince. "Bethany," Bryce's voice held concern. "It's nothing," she assured him. "Just the baby," she broke off as water suddenly soaked her skirts. "Oh, Bryce, I think the baby's coming." What followed was a flurry of activity. Sarah was sent to stay with the children while Bryce rode for the midwife in town. Daniel, showing remarkable maturity, helped prepare the bedroom and kept Henry occupied and away from the birthing chamber. The labor progressed quickly, too quickly for the midwife to arrive in time. Bethany found herself relying on her own experience and Bryce's steady presence as contractions ripped through her body. "I can't do this without help," she gasped as another pain peaked. "Yes, you can," Bryce assured her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Bethany Xavier." His confidence bolstered her, and when the final moments came, it was Bryce who caught their son as he entered the world with a lusty cry that belied his early arrival. "A boy," he announced, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he placed the infant on Bethany's chest. "We have a son." The baby, red-faced and indignant at his abrupt arrival, calmed as Bethany cradled him close. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "You were in quite a hurry to join us." When the midwife finally arrived, she found the new parents already besotted with their Christmas child. She helped with the afterbirth and checked both mother and baby, declaring them remarkably healthy despite the precipitous delivery. "What will you name him?" she asked as she prepared to leave, satisfied that all was well. Bethany looked to Bryce, who sat on the edge of the bed, one finger captured in his son's surprisingly strong grip. "Thomas," he said softly. "Thomas Bryce Xavier." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes at his choice, this honoring of the man whose absence had, in a roundabout way, brought them together. "It's perfect," she agreed. "Little Thomas, born on Christmas Eve." Later, when the children were allowed in to meet their new brother, Bethany watched as each carefully touched the baby's tiny fingers and marveled at his miniature features. "He's so small," Daniel observed. "Smaller than Henry was, isn't he?" "A bit," Bethany nodded. "But he'll grow quickly." "Can I hold him?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Bryce helped position her in a chair, showing her how to support the baby's head as he transferred Thomas into her arms. The sight of her daughter, who had once been so hungry and afraid, now cradling her baby brother with such gentle confidence, brought fresh tears to Bethany's eyes. "Are you crying because it hurts?" Henry asked, climbing carefully onto the bed beside her. "No, sweetheart," she assured him, pulling him close. "Sometimes people cry when they're very, very happy." "Are you very, very happy, Ma?" Daniel asked, suddenly serious. She looked around at her family, at Bryce standing protectively behind Sarah and the baby, at Henry curled against her side, at Daniel watching her with his father's thoughtful eyes, and felt her heart might burst with the fullness of her joy. "Yes," she said simply. "I am the happiest woman in all of California." As the winter melted into spring, baby Thomas thrived, growing plump on his mother's milk and basking in the adoration of his siblings. Bryce expanded the ranch operations, adding more cattle and hiring 2 permanent hands to help with the increasing workload. Bethany, recovered from childbirth, resumed her role as the heart of their home, managing the household with quiet efficiency while nurturing her growing family. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Bryce took Bethany's hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked unexpectedly. "Regret what? This life? Marrying again so quickly, taking on the ranch, another baby?" She studied him, surprised by the question. "Not for a single moment. Why would you ask such a thing?" he shrugged, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I saw Mrs. Wilkins in town today. She mentioned how fortunate you were that I came along when I did." His expression darkened. "As if I were some kind of salvation, not a man who loves you." "Jeremiah Wilkins' wife has always had more opinion than sense," Bethany said dryly. "Besides, she's not entirely wrong." "Oh," his eyebrow rose, "you did save us in a way." "My children were hungry and I had nothing left to give them." She leaned against his shoulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "But salvation works both ways, Bryce. You filled our table, yes, but we filled your heart." "That you did," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That you certainly did." Thomas began to fuss from his cradle just inside the open window, and Bethany rose to tend to him. Bryce followed, watching as she lifted their son, now plump and thriving at 5 months. "I think he's hungry," she said, settling into the rocking chair Bryce had made for her. "Like his papa," Bryce grinned, dropping a kiss on the baby's downy head before leaving them to the intimate ritual of nursing. As Thomas suckled contentedly, Bethany gazed out the window at the ranch, at the land that was now truly theirs, at the life they had built from the ashes of her grief. The road had not been easy, but the journey had led them here, to this moment of perfect peace. Outside, she could hear Daniel and Sarah laughing as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Henry's high voice begged them to wait for him. On the horizon, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, unchanging yet ever beautiful, like love itself. Bethany Xavier closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for hungry hearts filled, for the cowboy who had given her family not just food for their table, but hope for their future. And as the evening star rose over Panamint Valley, she knew with absolute certainty that all of this was exactly where she was meant to be. 5 years passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound to the Xavier Ranch. The herd had grown substantial, requiring additional hands and making Bryce one of the more prosperous ranchers in the area. Bethany had given birth to another child, a daughter named Grace, now 3 and the image of her mother with her auburn curls and determined spirit. Daniel, at 14, had grown tall and lanky, showing promise as a horseman that made Bryce secretly proud. Sarah, 12 and blossoming into young womanhood, had developed her mother's skill with a needle and her father's head for figures, often helping with the ranch accounts. Henry, 9 and mischievous, was everyone's favorite storyteller, spinning tales that kept the bunkhouse hands entertained for hours. And Thomas, their Christmas child, was a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle heart. On a warm June evening, with the children finally asleep and the day's work complete, Bethany and Bryce sat on the porch swing he had built for their first anniversary, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Bryce asked, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Standing in the snow with nothing but determination keeping me upright." She smiled against his chest. "The fiercest, most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on," he corrected. I knew then, though I wouldn't have admitted it even to myself. Knew what? She prompted, though she suspected the answer. That I'd found home. His arm tightened around her. Not this land, not the ranch, though I love it dearly, but you, Bethany. You and the children. You were the home I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. She raised her face to his, the love of 5 years having only deepened with time and trials shared. And you were the answer to a prayer I barely had the courage to whisper. Their kiss was gentle, familiar yet never routine. The passion between them banked but ever present like embers ready to flame at the slightest breath. As they sat in companionable silence, watching the moon rise over the valley that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners, Bethany reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them to this moment. From a widow's desperation to a family's abundance, from hunger to fulfillment, from emptiness to love. "What are you thinking about?" Bryce asked, sensing her contemplation. Bethany smiled, intertwining her fingers with his as the night settled around them like a familiar blanket. "I'm thinking that sometimes the darkest winters lead to the most beautiful springs." And as her husband's arms encircled her more tightly, as the ranch house behind them sheltered their sleeping children, as the stars continued their ancient dance overhead, Bethany Xavier knew that this was not just a happy ending, but a joyful continuation, a love story that would echo through generations to come. Born from a time when her children were hungry, and she had nothing left, when a cowboy named Bryce Xavier had filled their table and, more importantly, their hearts.